Wait, where? What? I'm in a box!
Oh no. No, not the box.
This is the Escape the Zoo podcast. With your host, Daniel Clark.
Well, Federico, thank you so much for joining the podcast. I'm obviously a huge fan and super excited to chat. I wanted to kind of jump in with one of the more unique animals that I've seen you photograph extensively, which is the caracal. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Caracal, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's just when you think of African cats, you're always going to lions and leopards. Can you talk a little bit about that creature?
So the caracal is a relatively small cat when compared to leopards, cheetahs, and lions. Can weigh up to 15 kg. Is slightly bigger than a house cat, and is widespread in Africa and Middle East. It's it's quite widespread and it's quite common. It's not a particularly endangered animal,
okay.
But it's really, really, really difficult to see in the wild, and especially to photograph it in the wild. The main reason is because it's primarily nocturnal, although as I've seen in my all the days I've spent with them, they were not necessarily so nocturnal,
right.
But very elusive. Generally, they're very elusive, very shy animals. They're extremely difficult to see, really good at hiding in even the smallest patches of grass. So they're really difficult to find, really difficult to follow. And so it was quite probably the most difficult animal I photographed in my time.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because actually, when I moved to the Masai Mara in Kenya, that's where I spent about almost 5 years of my life living almost every day in the Masai Mara, which is part of the Serengeti ecosystem.
Right. Yeah.
It's the northern tip of the Serengeti ecosystem. It's in Kenya. It's where I live. It's where I'm based. I've been based here since 2002.
Oh, wow.
And and it's the Masai Mara is particularly known for cats, lions, leopards, and cheetahs. They're abundant, easy to see, but also caracals and servals are there. But when I first moved for 2 years before, I never saw one caracal at all, and it has always been talking to other people, other photographers, other guides. It's always been that holy grail kind of animal that no one really sees. They're there, but you just don't see them, or if you do, it's just a fleeting glimpse across the road. And so it's that was my perception of the caracal.
Is the elusiveness? Are they typically because of the high grasses, or are they denning somewhere?
They tend to hide the grass. Of course, they tend to live in places where there is a lot of cover, so tall grass or bushy areas. They also go into burrows, not necessarily to den, but also maybe just for a day. Maybe they hide for one day in a den. That's what I found out through the weeks I spent with them. So they might disappear in a hole and then come back out in the evening, and so. But they generally always looking for places to hide, basically.
Okay.
So that's and as I said, for the first couple of years of being on Game Drive every day, you would really hardly hear of anyone seeing one.
Oh, wow.
No, it's an extremely. But then one day in 2009, that was in October 2009. That was when I had my first encounter with actually two caracal, a mother and with a cub, almost full-grown cub.
Oh, wow.
Just completely by chance, just driving around, I saw an animal just appear on top of a termite mound from the tall grass. These termite mounds frequent in the savannas and the plains of East Africa. They're kind of small hills coming up from the plains. So these animals jumped on top of this termite mound. I couldn't really even understand what it was, because it was really something I had never seen before, and I had to grab my binoculars, and I was shocked to see it was a caracals.
Oh, wow.
But then I looked again. There was another one in the grass. But another thing one of the things that people mostly say when people are lucky enough to see a caracal is that you just see it for a second, and then as you try to approach it, it disappears because they're shy. And so I thought, this I might not see them again, because then after this first sighting, the caracal went into the tall grass, and I couldn't see them anymore. So I drove closer.
You're in a car. Okay.
Yeah, I was in a car. All this happens from a vehicle.
Okay.
You can't. It's really not allowed to go to drive around in the parks. To walk around, because there's so many lions, buffalo, elephants, hippos.
You're just asking for it if you do.
Exactly. No, it's not allowed. It's even against the law. So it's really not
I didn't
possible.
know that.
So, it's absolutely not possible. So I drove closer. And obviously they were gone. They had really disappeared, as everybody says.
Right.
They were really nowhere. But then I remember thinking, that's the reputation. But they cannot have physically disappeared, dissolved. They must be somewhere. So I stopped the car and started scanning with the binoculars everywhere. And until finally, after a lot of searching, I found them. They were, both of them, clumped together inside just a small patch of grass. So it's
cool.
completely hidden in just one small patch of grass. So I could only see the tip of the ears. The caracal is... maybe we'll have a chance to see some images during the show. It's a brownish cat. It's a mostly brown reddish cat with the black ears and black tufts of ears at the top of the tufts of hair at the tip of the ears, which is their their main feature. So I could see their ears sticking out of the grass. So I thought, how can I take a picture? And I started taking out the camera. In that moment, another vehicle appeared, and the two caracals panicked.
Right.
So they were afraid. Obviously, they were not habituated to cars, and so they ran away. The mother led the baby away.
How pissed were you at that other car at that point?
I know, but how can it's not their fault? They didn't even know.
No, I know, but I could imagine you sitting there just being like, "Get away from here!"
Exactly. But so I followed them with the binoculars as they walked away, and I saw them go in again, as I said, into a hole. I saw them disappear into a hole in the ground. In the plains, there are many holes dug by warthogs, aardvarks, and then used by hyenas. So it's quite common to find holes in the ground. It's quite common.
Wait, a hyena will go underground?
Hyenas den underground, absolutely. Yeah,
I didn't know that. That must be a big den.
Hyenas, they don't necessarily make the holes initially, but they tend to modify holes dug by other animals. So they make very big dens underground with different entrances and chambers.
Wow, I had no idea.
This is the spotted hyena, the spotted hyenas.
Wow.
So that's... So on that day, I wasn't alone. I was with some guests because I was I was guiding these guests on a photographic safaris, and it was migration time. It was October, so the guests wanted to see the migration during the middle of the day. It was the last day, actually.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. It must be frustrating when you see something that elusive, and then all of a sudden everybody's like, "I want to see the lions," and you're like, "No, not today."
Exactly. But the caracals were in the hole, and that we waited for a while, and they didn't come out again. So, and it was getting late morning by then. So we said, okay, let's go and try to see the migration. The crossing, the famous wildebeest crossing, always happens in the middle of the day. Generally, often happens in the middle of the day.
Right.
So we went and we saw the migration. So after the early afternoon, we said, well, then what should we do? Shall we go back to that area and we see if we can find these cats again? So we went. And there was no one around, of course. So we went back to this hole, and there was this track right quite close to the hole, but the hole was about 50 meters away. So we drove up and stopped and started using the binoculars, seeing if around the hole at quite a distance. We were looking at quite a distance.
Wow.
To see if we would see the caracals again, and nothing. It was a cloudy day, fortunately. So it wasn't hot. It wasn't too hot. So we just we said, okay, let's wait. They might still be in the hole. They might come out later in the afternoon, maybe at dusk or at sunset. And then all of a sudden, I realized that the caracal was actually basically not even 10 meters away from the car. So it was much closer than where we were looking.
Wow.
And this caracal was just lying there next to us, looking at us, completely exposed, completely relaxed. So we picked the cameras up, trying to make as little noise and movement as possible, because with her being so close, I was afraid that she would at this
just jump.
Just the sudden.
What was the cause of her being? Do you think while you guys were looking from 50 meters away, she was close and just got used to you being around?
Basically. We were looking. So many times you're focused in a certain area and you don't see anywhere else. Sometimes it happens when animals are too close. I realize that so many times you almost don't see them because you're used to looking.
Right, but almost like counterintuitively, it probably helped out because the cat got comfortable while you guys were looking away.
Exactly.
Yeah.
She obviously she had been there all along, because if she had been moving, I would have seen her, of course. But she had been just stationary and being there all along.
And was it the same one, do you think, with the cub earlier?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Actually, the cub. After a few minutes, the cub showed up as well.
Oh, wow.
And the cub was playing around. They were doing all sorts of things, completely relaxed in our presence, playing. And cub was biting the mother, and the mother was. It was unbelievable. The whole afternoon. They were out and just all not even 20 meters away, even less. And actually, the funny thing is that at one point down the track, another vehicle came. We could hear it in a distance coming the same direction where we were. And the caracal heard it at that moment as well. And as soon as she heard the vehicle, she went back into the hole.
Oh, God.
Then the vehicle passed. As I said, oh, no, it's finished.
Yeah.
Then the vehicle carried on, because obviously they couldn't see anything. So the vehicle carried on. And as soon as this vehicle was gone, she came out again and they resumed all their playing and everything. So it was just an unbelievable afternoon. The whole afternoon we spent with them. And it was already that afternoon, I think I took more wild caracal images than most people have ever
taken a lifetime,
even seen them in the wild. Absolutely. But I remember driving back to camp. I thought to myself, this is an unbelievable situation. This is something that might not happen again anymore. To have two caracals so relaxed and so confident with at least one vehicle we have seen. At least one vehicle. So I thought I want to follow them and try to see them again, try to find them again. So this safari ended. I had with this guest, the safari ended, and I remained alone in the Mara for the whole. This was October,
right.
So for the whole of November, I was alone in the Mara again. So I started patrolling the area, driving around every day, looking for them. Nothing. Couldn't find them anymore.
Right.
This was for about 3 weeks.
So every day you go in and just looking for the caracal.
Out early morning, just looking, searching. Go into around every bush, nothing.
I think that's just something that people don't grasp onto is the dedication of going in
The dedication,
21 days in a row looking for one animal.
And not seeing anything. The good thing is that being based in the Mara, living in the Mara, I didn't have the urge that somebody who comes for a week or 10 days has of having to find, and to photograph everything. Because actually in the Mara, there's so many things to see and photograph, and that it might seem crazy to just focus on one. But when you're there all the time, this is the big advantage. Being there all the time, having all the time of the world, that enables you to really focus on one thing, and especially on such a difficult subject, such a difficult thing.
Well, I also imagine that it allows you to have much more authentic experiences with the wildlife too, just because you're not feeling like you're chasing them down in a car when you have to do.
Absolutely. That, and as I found out with the caracal, it was the main thing that was when I found them again, and then when I managed to follow them for many days in a row. The thing I found out is how important was my behavior in relation to them.
Right.
Most of the time I was alone. So I, as we have seen, they were kind of accepting the presence of one vehicle. But it was crucial to always be as little intrusive as possible.
Right.
Always giving them space, always never pushing them, never going too close, letting them come to me as much as possible. So this was really crucial, because being too aggressive with the vehicle, it's the end of the photography. They would disappear, and I've seen it through the years when other vehicles came and they were really, really anxious to take a picture. But sometimes the caracal is hiding. You can't force the animal to come out for you. And so in those moments, I would just park away, binoculars set on the exact spot where they had disappeared, where they were sleeping, and so just waiting for them to wake up. But other people might not have all this time and patience, so they were driving in, and that was the end.
How expansive is the Mara in the sense, like, is it pretty easy to get away from other cars, or is it something where you're trying to take this approach that you're always constantly in the back of your mind stressed that somebody's going to kind of come up on
the
you?
Mara, unfortunately, the Mara is not a very big park. It's only about 1,500 square kilometers.
Oh wow!
And it's especially in the high season, which means July to September, and then basically July to September. That it can be really basically impossible to get away from other cars. It's almost impossible. Very difficult. These encounters happen mostly in the wet season, in the low season, when there were no vehicles around. So that was October, November. November is a very quiet month in the Mara generally. So the vehicles are few. Mm-hmm. So that was possible. But I must say that in the next couple of years, I've had sightings of this same female as on this day. I had luck to see her with 3 different litters.
Oh my God!
This one in 2009. Then in 2010, I spent another about 10 days with her with another cub. And then in 2011, she had 2 cubs, and I could spend really a lot of time with them when she had 2 cubs, which was quite amazing. And this was August, actually. This was mostly happening in the month of August, which is the high season. The good thing is that people don't have very few people have the patience to wait and search, because the searching was the crucial thing with caracals. I would leave them one evening, in the evening in one spot, and then to find them the next day was extremely difficult. But at least having the place where I left them the day before, I could start from there and start looking. And then when you're the first one who finds them, you have a lot of time on your own before other vehicles show up. And generally, by the time they show up, many times the caracals are already maybe asleep because it's late morning.
Right.
So then it's a waiting game, and people don't don't
for
have that
most
patience
people
to wait.
who get one photo of these during their entire career in the Mara, was there anybody being like, "What the hell are you doing? How are you getting all of these photos?"
That's because now, when after the 2013 sightings of caracals have almost almost completely finished in the Mara, it has returned as it was before this female in 2009 showed up. Now it's again almost impossible to see.
So it's not
caracal.
it's not that their numbers are lower. It's just that there was just this one caracal who is
bizarrely
more accustomed or comfortable hanging out
exactly.
with people. Interesting.
Exactly. There was this one which allowed one car, and then by the time in 2011 came, she was allowing 1 or 2 cars. She had become a little more habituated, and then in 2011 another caracal showed up in the same area, which is quite interesting, and I'm not sure if there was a relation between the two females. Caracals, of course, as most cats, as almost all cats, they're solitary animals, and they're so they don't live together. They're solitary. But these two caracals were kind of living more or less in the same area for 1 year in 2011. And so another caracal showed up. These other ones showed up in 2011. And 2013, I could spend some time with this caracal, with the cub, with this other caracal. The first one had disappeared in a rocky terrain, rocky area. I had lost sight of her after 2011. And then in 2013, I spent some time with this other caracal, but she was much more shy than the previous one. And then in 2014, unfortunately, this caracal was killed by a leopard. So this other female, which was slightly more habituated, also disappeared. And so now things are basically difficult again. Basically, it's now again almost impossible to.
How did you find that out? Did you see the caracal? Somebody saw the leopard with it?
I didn't see it personally. I heard it, and I heard of the sighting, and I saw a picture of the event of the leopard. So it was really, really. But that's part of nature, unfortunately.
Right.
That's what leopards do. That's.
Is that a pretty common prey item for a leopard? Or do they have trouble
no. It's very difficult for a caracal to be surprised by a leopard. They're generally very alert animals, but leopards are animals that can feed and hunt anything, really, from a small mouse to a giraffe.
Right.
So anything in between goes for a leopard. So it can happen. Leopards have been known to take any several cheetahs as well. Leopards do kill cheetahs as well. So that can happen. But it's rare. Of course, it's rare because they're all very alert animals. So basically, starting from that day in October of 2009, and especially with this female, the first 3 years, after searching back to that October, November 2009, after searching for about 3 weeks without any luck, I finally found them some good distance away from where I'd left them. That's probably one of the reasons why I wasn't finding them. They had shifted. But that's as I was following them, I was basically finding out about their behavior. Actually, when you look at books and behavior books of mammals, there's not much about caracals at all, because very few people have spent time with them in the wild. Actually, most of the research that has been done has mostly been done through camera traps or picking up spores, and not really by visual observation.
Okay.
So even for me, understanding their movement was kind of a new thing. Whereas with animals like lion, leopards, cheetahs, you know how they behave. You know, one is territorial, one has a wider range. So you can really. Whereas with these ones, it was when I found out they had moved so much, then I realized how much they would move. And if I think of all the places where I've seen this female through the years, I realized that she basically was covering a huge area and making it extremely difficult to find her from let's say if you lost her for one day, then the second day, then the third day, then the places where she could have moved were she could have been everywhere, basically.
Do you ever get contacted by researchers who are interested in stuff like this, learning more?
No, not really by researchers. I've been contacted by the BBC for their documentaries.
Okay, cool.
To try to get a feeling of how it would be to try to film caracals in the wild. And I think nothing much ever came out of it, because it is such a something that you cannot really count on.
Right.
Because you might spend 2 months in the Mara without seeing one, even if all you're doing is searching for one. So it's I think they never really ended up doing anything specifically about them. Because
is that a tough thing to talk to BBC about? Because I would imagine if BBC came, you'd want to work with them. So like for Planet Earth or something, you're like, yes, I want to do it. And you're like, yeah, I can definitely find a caracal, but you don't want to. It's tough to give them the true answer, because you know that that's likely going to make them not say yes to coming out.
Basically, I was being very frank. Also, because when they asked me, it wasn't in the time when I was actually following that female. When it was after that female had kind of disappeared. So it's.
And you don't want to deal with the stress of them coming and being like, oh,
absolutely.
shit,
But then I must say they were really asking me things, but not really wanting to necessarily work with me, because they have a big team of people they work with in East Africa. So It was just that they were seeing the pictures and they were seeing so they were asking me some advice, but then with the idea of going on with their own team. But I told them this is, to me, it's just, if you're there all the time, like for 2-3 years, and then you might get lucky once, you find one, and then you can try to follow, but just coming out of the blue and hoping to find one,
that's not a good proposition to a television crew.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. So this was basically probably the most exciting, and the one I wasn't really even thinking of when I moved to the Mara, when I started doing photographing full time. I wasn't even dreaming of doing something like this with the caracals. It was just something. The caracal was something that was just, you knew it was there, but maybe I wouldn't ever see one in my life. But then this happened, so it was particularly exciting.
Yeah, I can imagine. And for when you get those images and you know that they're as rare as they are, is the excitement from obviously just being able to experience that, but is there more of a likelihood of being able to sell that to like a National Geographic or something like that? Or do you typically just keep them for your books?
This is a difficult, it's a difficult question, because to me, the main thing is doing it for myself, for being there, for the joy of doing it, the joy of being in the wild, the joy of spending time with the animals. So obviously, as a photographer, the ambition is to try to take as beautiful pictures as much as possible, and obviously in such a place like East Africa, like the Mara, where there's so many people that visit, so many photographers, it's just really difficult to make photographs that are new, unseen, to photograph something that is not been already photographed by anyone before. It's really extremely difficult. So to find a situation like this for the caracals, besides the joy, also I was thinking this is something that these are images that no one has ever captured before. Then but then whatever comes after is I've sent those images to the BBC magazine, the BBC Wildlife magazine. They took them in, and some other magazines took them in. National Geographic, they weren't really interested. I think maybe they weren't. I don't know. They weren't. I don't know. They didn't find. I actually. I'm not very good with pushing and marketing my images. If I on one side, this is not really my my main thing. The ability of pushing and trying to be self-promotion is not really a good part. Something that I do well.
It's something I think about a lot when you think of at least my friends who are more artistic types. Generally those don't go hand in hand, like being a business focused person and being more of an artistic person. And it makes you think like what amazing art is out there that's just completely undiscovered because it's done by somebody who has just never had a desire.
Yeah.
I'm not saying you in particular, because obviously I've found you and I've been a fan for a while, but I'm sure there's somebody just who like is just out, who knows where, that's an absolute musical genius and nobody ever gets to see his stuff or her stuff.
Absolutely. I think that if you really want to break through in one of these artistic challenges, you have to have both. You have to. Otherwise, it's and for me, it's really every time I have to do anything that comes to self-promotion stuff is like forcing me into it, and it's like a big internal struggle for me. For me, I would just be in the wild, take the pictures, work on the pictures, but you have to force yourself to try to do as much as possible. Otherwise, you just end up, unless you do it for a hobby and it's not your living, then it's another story. But if you really want to, you have to have both. You have to try to do both as much as possible. I
think something that's really unique and something that's been really fun for me as a fan to follow along with your work is kind of similar to the story you just told with the caracals and the work that goes into understanding them and knowing them. It seems like you've spent years with some of these specific animals to the point where you know them incredibly intimately. How do you think that can you talk a little bit about the process through something like that and how that kind of differentiates, or just how that helps you more appreciate the experience of being out there?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the things one of the reasons why I decided to move physically to the Masai Mara and to spend time in one place only, as opposed to many photographers who just do one trip there, one trip there, one trip there, one trip, go all over the world. I just thought, no, I want to concentrate on one place.
Right.
And in that one place, one animal. For example, one of the main animals I've spent time with is the leopard.
Mm-hmm.
Leopards are also difficult animals to follow and photograph, but they're territorial. The advantage of leopards is that they're territorial. So by working intensively in one territory and being able to recognize the animals one by one, then I could focus on one particular animal and her offsprings. It was a female.
Right.
So she had many cubs, many litters as I followed her and as I spent time with her, and it really being able to know the animals and follow that, not just a leopard, but that particular leopard. When you're seeing what she's doing anytime, even if she's just, let's say, for example, walking along the river, you're already thinking, what is she doing? Is she going from where to where? Where is she going? Maybe her cubs are in there, or as you know the background of her story, everything that she does, you can relate it to her past, and so you develop a much more intimate knowledge of the animal, and that obviously that helps for the photography, because if you know that this leopard always, when she walks in this area, she always passes by, or almost always passes by, a certain area, you can say, okay, I'll go there and wait for her, and get her here when she comes here. Or if you know that she has cubs in a certain area, you can already, let's say, position and wait for her to come back to her cubs. And all these sorts of things are very difficult to do unless you have a direct knowledge of the particular animal and the territory, the area. So that also helps a lot with the photography in being able to anticipate. But as I say, the main, let's say, the main thing for me was being able to see these animals grow from being. Sometimes I've seen some of these, for example, the leopard that I mentioned before had her second to last litter before she died. She had 2 cubs, and she remained with one female, one daughter.
Mm-hmm.
And this daughter now has taken over the territory over mother. When the mother died, she took over her territory, and now she's having cubs of her own.
Oh,
so it's
beautiful.
For me, having seen this leopard when she was a tiny cub, now seeing her having cubs of their own, it's really, really beautiful, and it's something that's really special, and makes you feel like you're really having a glimpse into their world. Let's say, you're kind of you're getting a little bit into their secrets and into their mystery.
And what does that entail? Like, is that something where it's a once a month type of thing, or is that an everyday for a certain period of time? Like, for me, I mean, it's hard to even imagine being able to differentiate cat to cat. So like when you see a baby cub, how do you know that it's that female that's now prowling around? Is it because you just have seen it so frequently?
Yes. After some of these animals, when you see them all the time, you start to. At first they all look the same, but then you get used to their just to the shape of their eyes, the color of their eyes, the ears, everything. But in order to be really sure and not to make mistakes, you have to have scientific methods to identify them. So what I've been doing ever since I moved to the Marais, I've been taking pictures, even just identification pictures of all the leopards and cheetahs.
Cool.
I was seeing. In order, and with leopards and cheetahs, the way to identify them through the years is through the spots.
It's like a fingerprint.
Spots. It's like fingerprints. They don't change. They're unique to each one, and they don't change through the years. Through the years. So every time I would see one of these cats, I would try to take a picture, even if it's not a beautiful picture, but just an ID picture, to keep in a sort of a catalog. And when I began, I had a paper catalog, pictures, printed pictures. Now I have everything in the phone, because now everything is so much easier. So I have all these animals in the phone, and so that's how, basically. So many times you just see one, and you see leopard, you see a cheetah, and you can identify immediately, but you can also make mistakes if you are in doubt, if you don't counter check with scientific methods. So you see the spots, the way the spots are on the face. That's how we do. That's how you
so
do
cool.
it. Yeah.
How are the leopard populations doing?
The leopards, of all the big cats, they are probably the less endangered, because they're, as I say, they're very adaptable. Mm-hmm. They can eat anything, as I said before. So they can live in so many habitats, because they're not tied to a specific prey species. For example, lions are much more linked to the presence of medium to big size herbivores.
Right.
So if a lion would never be able to live in a forest just outside of Nairobi, for example, because there's nothing to hunt for them. Whereas, although we have Nairobi National Park, so that's another. So I probably picked a bad example, because we have Nairobi National Park, which is full of lions. But there are some parks, some forests within the city where you can't find leopards, because they feed off monkeys, they feed off hares, rabbits, dogs, domestic dogs, stray dogs. Leopard can hunt anything.
Yeah,
Lion
well, even in Planet Earth too, they showed some crazy footage of leopards in the cities, just like going around and picking off like pigs and stuff like that were in the cities. Exactly.
So this great adaptability makes them the less the less endangered animal, and so they're able to survive in many habitats, in many places, even close to humans. Although you never see them because they're extremely elusive, and that's how they survive. You just never see them. But
coyotes are kind of like that in California. I mean, apparently there's a huge coyote population in downtown LA, and you hardly ever see them, but it's just because they can eat literally anything.
Really? Okay. I heard even mountain lions would live not too far from Los Angeles.
Yeah, the mountain lions. Pictures. The mountain lions. There's some in Griffith Park, which is like the observatory where they filmed La La Land. But there's a few. Yeah. The difficulty with the mountain lions now is that because there's so many highways in Los Angeles, it's really created these islands where the lions can't cross between. So there's a lot of just isolation, which leads to a lot of obviously reproductive issues if there's only so many cats. But they're working on a huge project to build one of those bridges across the big highway in Los Angeles so that they can start getting across and start having a little bit more success as a species. But I still think like those numbers are pretty low. Whereas, I mean, I was walking in my neighborhood the other day and I live in a very urban area. Yeah. There are two massive coyotes just walking down the road.
Imagine.
It's crazy. It's absolutely wild.
Well, it shows the resilience of these animals, how they, and obviously as the leopard example shows, the ones that better adapt to all sorts of climatic conditions, and they are the ones who survive. For example, a lion would not be able to live, a cheetah as well would not be able to live unless
there's
in certain conditions, with certain space, with certain prey species. That's why their numbers are much lower and they're more endangered than the leopard.
But my dream is to find one of those mountain lions in Los Angeles. I would love that.
It's not going to be easy.
No, it's a process. I mean, but there's that. Have you ever seen that Steve Winter photo where it's literally the Hollywood sign in the background?
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Amazing
to think that.
That's the picture I was thinking of. Absolutely.
So what got you into all of this? Was this something that as a kid you were always passionate about wildlife or photography, or it was kind of developed?
Absolutely, yeah.
Where'd you grow up?
Yeah. I grew up in Italy, in a city in the north called Milan.
Okay.
Which is quite a big city, actually. Probably Italy's the second biggest.
It's like the fashion capital of the world, isn't it?
Fashion capital and industrial capital as well. Wasn't really anything. Anything.
Are you the fashionista of the safaris?
Absolutely not. That's why I moved away from there. No, not at all. It wasn't really my place, and so it's immediately after university. I moved here. I grew up with the passion for wildlife since when I was 3 years old.
Oh wow!
I was. With kids, many kids love wild animals, and it's not that uncommon. But with me, the thing remained, and I was really reading books and all, just dreaming of the wildlife, and especially of Africa. As much as I like all animals in the world, of course, but for me, it's always been Africa.
Right.
The savannas of Africa. So, and I came here on a trip with my parents. They took me on a trip when I was 6 years old. That was the first time I came, on a safari, and that was my
this is it.
This is my place. But obviously, then I went back to study, university, and everything. So after university, I finally moved for good. That's about 16 years ago.
Oh wow!
Yeah. I've been already 16 years living in Kenya. And the photography started when I was a teenager, basically when I was 15, 16. I grew up in a family of both photographers. My father and my mother, they're keen photographers, although not professionals, but very, very advanced. So I kind of grew up with photographs being shown and going around the house all the time, photographic books, in the house.
Mm-hmm.
So I was kind of almost naturally brought into a kind of a photographic environment, and so obviously the two things came together when I moved here, and so that's what I've been doing ever
Was there
since,
any wildlife
basically.
to photograph in Italy?
Not really. There is actually. Italy is of all the European countries is one of the ones with more wildlife, because we have wolves, we have bears, we have ibex, we have it's all sorts of kind of European deers.
Yeah, in the Alps and stuff.
But in the Alps, in the center, and so there are animals, and there are beautiful national parks as well. And but with me, it's for some reason I've always been attracted to Africa, and so I'd never really photographed animals much when I was in Italy at all. Were
you nervous moving to Africa just because it was such a big change for you, or is it something like this is the calling and I'm going to do it? Because it sounds like a big jump.
No, it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy at all, because it's after university. Through university I found an internship for 3 months here in Nairobi.
Okay.
So that's what I did. For 3 months I moved to Kenya first, just for a limited period. But I really loved it. I absolutely loved being here. I loved living here. I loved the way of life, and I loved obviously being close to the animals. So, but then when I went back after these 3 months, I had to do my military service, which I did civil service instead. But so that's compulsory. So I had to go back, and then back then, now it's not anymore, but back then it was still compulsory to do 1 year of either military or civil service. So I did that. And then after that, then the big choice came. What do I do? Do I go to Africa for good, or because in those 3 months when I was here, I managed to get some contacts, and I was actually offered a job here in Kenya, here in Nairobi, not as a photographer, because I studied economics. I studied something that has nothing much to do with the animals and the photography. So I graduated
did too, actually.
in economics.
I studied finance and entrepreneurship, and I was like, I did a couple jobs in finance. I was like, I'm good on this. I think I'm going to switch over.
Yeah, exactly. That's more or less that's what happened to me as well. But so when I got an opportunity for a job here in an NGO in Nairobi, as a financial administrator, so that for me was perfect as a starting point, as moving, as something to give me a base, and then start the wildlife and the photography to follow. But still, it was very difficult to make that choice, because that was kind of moving completely. And at the same time, I was being offered, the funny thing is I was being offered jobs in Italy linked to my university, my degree. So some jobs and normal jobs in companies in Italy as in finance. So I ended up, after a lot of internal struggle, I ended up taking one of these jobs.
Oh, really? Where was it?
Yeah. It was imagine an oil company.
Wow.
It was big, but it was Italy's biggest oil company, working in setting up oil infrastructure for the oil business. And I started, I saw this is a good job. I'm going to travel all over the world. Maybe I should do this. And then, so I took this job. And then I remember the first day I walked into this big building, and I said, what the fuck did I do? I fucked up completely.
Before you made a mess. Jeez.
What did I do? What am I doing here? It was a strong realization.
Yeah,
it was a strong realization. It was what I needed to remove any doubt.
Yeah.
So after 3 months of that, I said, guys, I'm going to Africa.
I always say sometimes it's better I think it's more dangerous to have a job that you're like somewhat satisfied in than the one that you absolutely hate. Because when you hate, you want to better your circumstance. When you're
Exactly.
this is okay, it's paying me enough to get by, all of a sudden that's the type of thing you look down 15, 20 years and you're like,
And you
geez,
like
I
this
wish
is
I hated my job.
Exactly. But for me, it was the first day. It was I remember the first day. It was just, I hadn't even seen the job, but I realized immediately I'd made a
So
mistake.
did you quit?
I quit after 3 months. I gave them the notice. And after 6 months, I moved to Africa. I moved to Kenya with the job I found before in an NGO. So I did about 4 years in administration here in Nairobi of this NGO, and it was very interesting. I did a lot of work in Somalia, northern Kenya, all remote places. And in the weekends, I was going to the parks. Weekends, holidays, just driving to the park, driving, photograph every weekend.
Mm-hmm.
Then after about 4.5 years, for about 4 years, even that those weekends were not enough anymore. I wanted more. I wanted to, as I said, follow these animals day in, day out, every day, see what happens tomorrow, and then tomorrow, and then tomorrow. I realized that if I really wanted to do something in photography, do something not seen before, then do some good images, I needed more time. I needed to be full time on it. So I quit that job as well. And I bought a tent. I set it up in the Masai Mara, and I just moved there.
You moved to a tent in the Masai Mara?
Yeah. That's where I spent about 4 years of my life. Then as initially in a tent, and then as I started, because obviously I needed to pay myself for a living. Nobody was paying me to enjoy being out in the wild. So I had to find a way to make it sustainable. So I started guiding. I took a guiding exams here in Kenya, and I started guiding photographers. I'd been a photographer myself. I could be a guide for other photographers, with the advantage of having a guide that is also a photographer, which is not common. Especially at that time, about 10 years ago, it wasn't that common. Now there's so many more photographer guides are getting into photography. So it's not, but back then it wasn't that common. So I actually started getting safaris, having people book me for safaris, for guiding. So that's how I became.
So they don't let you walk in the Masai Mara, but they would let you camp in there? Was there any fear of?
No, there are designated camping sites.
Oh, got it.
There are camping sites. There are tented camps. There are established tented camps for guests, etc. And there are camping sites, so you can't just camp anywhere you want, but you can camp in designated places.
Got
and
it.
me being and me being a long-time resident, I wasn't just going there for 2 or 3 days. So I set up a tent, which was actually a kind of a semi-permanent tent, a big tent with a bed inside.
I would imagine you have a lot of equipment and stuff in there.
Well, the equipment was mostly in the car. I was
not leaving that out.
Keeping it mostly. No. And actually, the baboons were the main challenge, because sometimes they would break into the tent. They did it a couple of times, but
they're pretty ornery creatures, right?
Yeah, they're nasty creatures. They're very, very, especially if they understand that there is food around, food possibilities. They become quite very, very aggressive. So they broke into my tent, and
I have been obsessed with just entrepreneurship since I've been a kid, less because I had a particular passion that I wanted to pursue, and more just because I hated working for other people. It was just always, I hated other people telling me what to do. But you hear it time and time again about, you got to hone in on one thing and focus on it and give up everything you can to make sure you see out your passion. But I think quitting a big, well-paying oil job to move from Italy to Nairobi and then moving into a tent in the Masai Mara to get things going is about as giving up whatever you can to get your dream going as possible. So, kudos to you. That's a beautiful story.
It's been a long way. Yeah.
Do you still do a lot of guided tours?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I do. About nowadays. I spend about, because now I have a family with a kid. So these last couple of
Oh,
years,
congratulations! How old's
I've
the kid?
scaled down. I've scaled down a little bit on the time I spend in the bush. So, but I do about 4 months a year on safari, for about 4 or 5 months a year on safari,
And
guiding
where are you
all on
living
my
now?
own.
In Nairobi?
In Nairobi, yeah.
Okay,
We're
cool.
based in Nairobi, and so we are kind of in the middle of the East African most beautiful parks: Mara, Amboseli, Serengeti. Those are the
hell
places
yeah.
I go to the most.
When you moved to Kenya, you also mentioned that it was also just the way of life in addition to the animals. Was there something specific about the culture that kind of drew you there?
Basically, Kenya is the country where, as I said, I came when I was 6 years old, and that's where I came. And so when I found by coincidence that those 3 months I found the internship I did for 3 months from the university was again in Kenya, in Nairobi. So it was kind of all just leading somehow to here. And then when I moved here, I found some amazing people, just very, 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 very easygoing people, like absolutely open and never making you feel unwelcome, which is something that might happen from what I hear in other countries in Africa. Is not, also racial tensions. Maybe not as much anymore, but some years ago there were more in other countries in Africa. Whereas here, I've always felt completely welcome without any. So this has been a huge thing, and the climate is wonderful. And I think that the parks in Kenya are, and let's say in East Africa in general, are the most beautiful, and especially for a photographer of all. So this is
it's
really
just like
the place,
the perfect culmination of everything.
The perfect place, yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, things are not these 16 years I've lived in Kenya. I've seen a lot of changes, a lot of development, which on one side is good, but with it come a lot of environmental distraction. So it's been obviously things are changed. Still very good, but things are slowly changing.
Have you noticed that affecting the parks? Like, how are the parks doing in general, and the wildlife within them? Is the conservation focus, like, does Kenya in general do pretty well, or?
Well, Kenya is on one side, it does very well because it has some policies that I really, really believe in. A very clear policy against hunting, so that every animal that is killed by somebody who's doing it illegally, a criminal. There's no distinction between trophy hunters or culling of animals. So no animal can be killed.
That's cool.
Another thing is that animals are not owned by anyone, so they're kind of belonging to the country, the government, basically to the whole country. So each animal is not private property of anyone, and that opens up, of course, that enables the fact that people, even if you have an animal on your land, you can't do whatever you want with it, which is not, unfortunately, not what happens in other countries in Africa,
which is surprising. Such as what? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
For example, South Africa, which is basically the opposite philosophy of conservation, where animals are private property. They're traded, bred, farmed. People do whatever they want with the animals, kill them, reproduce, breed them, all sorts of things. Which is, I don't think it's any good. I much prefer a situation where wild animals are wild and belong to everyone. Every citizen of Kenya is entitled to the sense of ownership of these animals. So on some things I really like Kenya's approach. Some of the most famous conservationists and wildlife researchers are based here, have worked here. So there's a very strong conservation community here in Kenya, and even among the local people, there's quite a good movement of local people who believe in conservation, who want to preserve the animals.
That's awesome.
But on the other hand, the human population in Kenya has grown in this last, let's say, when I was 6 years old, that's 1982, there were 16 million people in Kenya. Now they're almost 50 million.
Wow.
So that's a massive human population increase.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So with this come all sorts of other issues. Human wildlife conflict is here in Kenya at the moment is the major challenge.
Like farm and cattle grazing type.
Cattle grazing is the main, because Kenya is a country with a very different habitats within it. There is a very fertile central plateau, which is forests, mountains, very fertile, a lot of agriculture, and animals in these areas are only confined in small pockets. But then to the east and to the west, you have a huge kind of semi-arid areas, savannas and bushy areas where agricultural farming is not possible or is not possible easily, and which is good because that has maintained significant wild animal populations. But the populations there are mostly pastoralists, people who live out of their livestock or goats and sheep. So on one side, this has been good because livestock doesn't necessarily clash with the presence of wild animals.
Right.
So a certain amount of livestock has coexisted forever with wild animals and kind of always also reasonably well. But now what is happening is that the balance between the number of livestock and the available land is completely changing. The number of livestock is increasing so much. The number of people is increasing, so the number of livestock is increasing as well. And the land not only is always the same, but is actually shrinking because agriculture is creeping in. Towns, people are starting building towns.
Irrigation gets better and can kind of get out of the fertile area a little bit. Yeah, exactly.
So the pressure on those areas is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. So that's one of the main challenges we're having. Actually, in most parks of Kenya now, when you go to a park, you are going to see some cattle inside the park as well. Besides, alongside the animals, the wild animals, you're going to see cattle as well.
And so is the bigger problem the worry of predation on these animals, or is it also that they're kind of eating the grass that some of the
all sorts of things, because the numbers are so huge that especially on dry years like it was last year, 2017 was a disaster. It was a very dry year. So when these herds of cattle are so huge that they basically eat away and completely entire areas of the parks when the situation is a bit extreme. So that obviously leaves very little food available for the wild animals. Plus, animals, when lions find themselves surrounded by such easy prey as cows, especially at night, because a lot of the grazing happens at night, they will try to hunt them, obviously. So then the livestock owners retaliate, and lions get killed, leopards get killed, carcasses get poisoned, so the vultures get poisoned. So they poison the carcass, so the lions eat it and they die. So, but then the vultures die. So
is that what happened? I don't know if this is too specific, but I heard a story about I don't even know where this is, but a part in Africa where they actually have tree climbing lions. And 8 of them, it's a very small population, and it's a weird little subsegment of lions, and 8 of them were poisoned, I think, a few weeks back.
Recently.
Yeah. Is that through I was always wondering, like, how would a lion be poisoned? Is that what it is? It's a carcass type of thing?
Absolutely. Queen Elizabeth, I think it was in Queen Elizabeth National Park in Uganda. They poisoned the carcasses. They poisoned when they find a cow carcass killed by lion, they will poison it. So all the animals that would feed on it die.
That was brutal.
Yeah,
I mean, they showed a video of just like the skeletons of the mom and like 6 cubs or something like that. It's just like, it's really hard, not to be a huge downer, but it was brutal to look at. I as a layperson, I was like, how did they get poisoned? It just seems so odd to me, but now it explains it.
That's how it happens.
So what are the measures that are being put into place? Like, are there people trying to help? Is there like an easy solution? Or it sounds like a complex thing.
No, not easy at all, because no government will want to really go against the needs and the wishes of such huge chunks of the population. And, governments, especially here in Kenya, governments are elected mostly on tribal basis. So
what
if
do you mean
by basically Kenya has about 40 tribes.
Oh, okay.
40 different tribes, and each the people are still very, very much linked to their own tribes. So political choices are made mostly on the basis of tribal connections and relations. So one tribe will vote for the candidate of their tribe most of the time. So you have now 2 or 3 main tribes that always fight for power. And so the votes of, let's say, for example, the Maasai, which are the one of the biggest pastoralist communities who live along the border between Kenya and Tanzania. Very difficult to find a government who will say, now no more cows in the park. It's very difficult to implement, because then you basically lose all the support and the votes from that entire community of people. So it's a very difficult, very, very big challenge. Very big challenge.
The economic value of the wildlife would be substantially higher for the country than the cattle, or is that not? Maybe I just don't understand the scale of the cattle.
It is definitely it is. But for those people, for the people who own the cattle, it's not necessarily an issue strictly that has to do with economics.
Okay, it's like a way of life.
Basically for them, now I'm talking about the Maasai, but Samburus have similar traditions. They have the cattle for them is their wealth. So a rich man in the Maasai community is one who has a lot of cows, not one who has a lot of money. And if he has a lot of money, he will buy the cows.
Right.
So the aim, the final aim to their, for their wealth is the cows. So if you're a rich man, you want to have many cows.
Okay.
You don't want a lot of money. So this skews up, challenges all our paradigms, our way of thinking. Because you think, like, for example, in the Mara, there's a lot. The Mara is an extremely visited area, that brings a lot of money to the community, a lot. So also the communities around the park they're quite receiving a lot of benefits from the park.
Right.
And in different ways, through private conservancies around the edges and jobs and guiding jobs, all sorts of things. But so people thought, okay, since they will make so much money out of the park, eventually they will want to protect it and, take care of it. That hasn't happened. That hasn't happened. So they're taking the money and buying the cows.
Right.
And so that in the long run is destroying the park. But it's a different. Yeah, for them.
I think it's a good point where, like, it's always so easy when you're not a part of a culture to be like, oh well, why don't they just do this or why don't they just do that? And it's like, because you just don't understand the dynamics of how intricate, how different each socio-dynamics can be within a different region. How about? Absolutely. I mean, I've seen you do a lot of beautiful photography of elephants. How are they doing in general? Like, is poaching a pretty present thing going on within the park?
Well, it's elephants are since when I was a small child, they've been my favorite animal. So it's been my. But then when in photography, I spent a lot of time with all other animals, as we've seen. But elephants still have a very strong place in my interest and in my photography as well. The poaching situation with elephants it's been extremely bad for the last 10 years, since about 2007, 2008. We've lost about approximately between 150 to 200,000 elephants.
Oh my God! In 10 years?
In 10 years, out of a population of about 600,000, something like that. So it's been really a very, very bad 10 years. That was linked mostly to the growth of the Asian economies and the demand for ivory that comes from those countries, such as China, mostly China, but other countries as well. Now the situation probably is kind of improving a little bit now. Kenya has been hit by poaching, but not as terribly as other countries. Probably the country that has been hit the most was Tanzania.
Okay.
Tanzania lost about half of their elephants from a population of about 110,000. They're now down to 50,000 or something like that.
Is that is that less money being put into protection, or is that something?
It's so many times the authorities have an involvement in this kind of businesses. So it's all a matter of seeing how much is the government involved in the poaching. And that's what has happened in Tanzania and in other countries as well. We've seen Zimbabwe. The former first lady, has been involved in deals with dealing with ivory.
I didn't know that.
So that's basically, it has to do a lot with the involvement of the authorities, or how much the authorities are actually willing to really stop this trafficking.
Right.
So Kenya has been not bad, but even here we have had cases of poaching, but now it's not so bad. The Mara unfortunately has been one of the most targeted areas in Kenya, but mostly outside the park. Obviously, animals don't know the borders of the park, and that's an issue that comes a lot in play with human wildlife as conflict as well. So many times the borders of the parks have not been laid down, keeping in mind the ecosystems dynamics, the movement of the animals.
Right.
They're just randomly put down. So animals move out of the parks in certain season, or even within the same, from day to night, they move in and out of the parks. So that exposes them to one side human wildlife conflict, because they come into contact with the populations, and to poaching, because they're less protected once they're outside the reserves. A lot of the protection, by paradox, in the parks is provided by tourists, by people
being there.
People being there. So actually, most of the poaching happens in areas where there are no tourists, obviously, and that's something that is worth keeping in mind, because obviously where there are tourists, there are a lot of people, guides, rangers, everything. Whereas in the remote areas, that's where the situation is much more challenging. So that's how the role of tourism, if properly utilized, can also be a tool to improve security for animals.
Cool. Yeah,
it's unfortunately that's not what always happens, because, for example, in the Mara, you get hundreds of people wanting to build camps all inside the Mara. Right. So it's difficult to convince people to move to more remote areas. But this is actually happening a little bit in Kenya on a positive side. We've talked about the impact of population growth before, but there's actually a lot of positive developments in Kenya, such as conservancies, private conservancies. So landowners getting together with their small pieces of land, so putting their land together and availing this land for conservation and tourism. So they let camps be built in their area,
that's
and
awesome.
they make a profit out of leasing the land to the camp. And so that has been working very well in the Mara, actually, up to the point that there's sometimes more animals outside the park in these private conservancies than inside.
Yeah, and it makes it so that the camps aren't as concentrated in one spot.
Exactly, and as you spread out tourism, also animals become more protected in those remote areas. So in the end, it has a very, very positive effect. Whereas when you concentrate camps all in one area, it has a negative effect because the disturbance to the animals become too much
in the limited protection range.
Exactly. So that's yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about if elephants are one of your first loves of an animal? Is there a particular experience with an elephant that would kind of rise to the top as your favorite?
Oh, well, it's probably been again going back to the past a little bit. I don't want to make it think like we are living in the past, but basically in between 2010 and 2012. I've spent some amazing time in Amboseli National Park, which is a relatively small national park at the base of on the border with the Tanzania, so in the south of Kenya, and is the park where you have the famous view of Mount Kilimanjaro behind the elephant. So it's an iconic place, amazing place, with a very, very high concentration of elephants. And probably the best time I spent with the elephants was there in the beginning of 2010. In 2009, there had been a massive drought in all of Kenya, extremely devastating drought. So many of the smaller of the baby elephants died, and also the older elephants couldn't make it through that drought. And in addition, elephants have an adaptation that blocks their coming into estrus period when the conditions are not right, when there's no food, when there's no water. And so they concentrate all their energy in finding food and sustaining themselves. But obviously getting into estrus and having a pregnancy when the food is not abundant, it's very stressful for the elephant, and it would probably be not successful. So they have developed this adaptation of females not getting into estrus when the conditions are not good, when it's too dry. So for the whole of 2009, the drought went on, and just at the end of 2009, finally the rains returned, and they were quite abundant rains. So food became abundant again. The one big characteristic of East Africa is how fast the leaves and the bushes, the trees regenerate, and the grass regenerate after a drought. So as the rains came, the food became abundant. All of a sudden, so many females came into estrus, more or less all at the same time. So they, as soon as the conditions were good again, they all came into estrus, and that sparked a period of extremely intense social activity. Wow! Which was fantastic to witness. So there were elephants, males fighting each other, mating, courtships, all sorts of things happening in Amboseli in the beginning of 2010. It was amazing to watch. Wow. And again, because all the females had come into estrus more or less at the same time, about 22 months later, that's beginning of 2012, all these females gave birth, all more or less at the same time again.
Wait, elephant pregnancies are how long?
22 months, almost 2 years.
For one elephant?
For one baby elephant, yeah.
What?
One baby.
That is
elephant. Yeah.
insane.
It's a long pregnancy. But consider that elephants have more or less the same lifespan as humans. They live up to 60, 65 years of age. So it's a
Right.
very long lifetime. And obviously an elephant takes probably a lot of time to develop and to be able
but
to.
wow, that's crazy.
22 months is a lot. Yeah.
They always say that
Yeah.
a big factor to the vitality of animals is something with the reproductive cycle. So if
The
you're only
reproductive
having
speed, exactly.
one animal every 22 months, that's a pretty low one. But the good thing is, I guess they're living longer and having more chances. But
Exactly.
That's an
They
insane
still have
number.
a lot of babies through their lifetime. Yeah.
That poor
it is.
mother,
It's one
she
of
must
its
be
big
very
challenges.
tired by the end of that.
At the end, yeah, absolutely. But again, as 22 months later, the planes were filled with babies. All the females were having new babies. It was amazing again to see and photograph the babies playing all over the place. So it was really, really. That's probably this to witness this cycle of life and kind of after all the devastation of the year before, to see life begin again so swiftly and rapidly and beautifully. It was extremely touching. It was really fascinating.
Yeah, I always talk. I mean, people who've listened to every episode of this podcast will probably get sick of me talking about it, but I think there's so much time and attention spent on the doom and gloom of conservation and how like we've lost so many animals over the last couple decades, which is true, and it's really sad. But something that's always been comforting to me is even experiencing in my own backyard, if you cut back some brush that's encroaching on the house or something to that effect, the resiliency of nature is mind blowing.
I mean, absolutely.
So
absolutely.
I do think it's something that, as dire as things can seem, if you do put the right policies or laws or just conservation efforts into effect,
management,
it's crazy
absolutely.
how quickly things can bounce back.
How quickly, absolutely. There are many parks in Africa which were completely devastated and now are being properly managed and they're flourishing, and so it's absolutely true, and that's it's comforting as long as we maintain the places, and that's absolutely comforting. Obviously, there's a certain lower limit under which no population of animal can go. So that's what we have seen with rhinos. Unfortunately, at the moment, we are losing rhinos at such a high rate that it's becoming also very difficult to. Especially the rhino is again another animal that has a very long reproductive cycle.
Okay.
So also 15, 16 months of pregnancy. So it's an animal that requires a lot of time to bounce back. And rhinos are poached because of the horns, again from Asian countries. So that is all true, but we have to make sure that we don't reach that lower limit under which recreation cannot happen.
Right, because then it's just, even if all the births are successful, the number to actually grow quickly it's just too low.
It's just not enough. Exactly.
Yeah. And then you start getting into. It's always sad when you hear
inbreed.
Yeah, there's inbreeding, and then there's also just the conservation efforts where they're largely done in human-controlled environments and not necessarily in the wild. And then, to me, like it's a sad thought, but I'm always wondering if the behaviors of those animals are exactly the same as if they had just been naturally.
Absolutely. Some of these animals, they can't even be reintroduced into the wild. Some of them, and some like cheetahs, they're very, very difficult to reintroduce into the wild. So that's definitely a challenge. Absolutely.
Is there one moment in your career that sticks out? And the answer might be no, but that sticks out as just kind of a moment where you realized like you're doing exactly what you wanted to be doing, and that this is just kind of like a perfect moment?
Yeah. Actually, there have been many. Actually, yeah. Obviously, not things not always go as you wish them. But the times when I'm out again, coming back to elephants in Amboseli, some of the times when I'm just parking there, surrounded by elephants, maybe at sunset, not another person in sight, just open plains, open savannas around, and this peace and quiet silence, wind, and I'm just sitting there, and those are the moments when I have this realization most of the time, when I'm just exactly doing what I want, and how lucky I am in a way. That's when I have the time to. But so many times, even when in the evening, when I'm just in the camp and I hear the lions roar at night, just out of the tent, oftentimes I think this is, let's see where I am. Look at where I am. I mean, just this is amazing. Yeah,
it's a beautiful thing.
Being able to be here and know that I'll be here again tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, and it's a good feeling. It's a good feeling, and it pays you back for all the. Sometimes when pictures don't, people don't, pictures don't work, or anything doesn't work, but still having that feeling is so good. It's really, really, it's that realization that it's good to have.
Yeah, definitely, and it's probably sparking a lot of jealousy and envy from everybody listening, because it sounds like a beautiful thing to experience. If you could put a billboard on the side of the highway that disseminates one message in 10 words or less, that's kind of something that you feel like is an important message to get out there, is there anything that comes to mind?
Oh, very difficult to.
It's a tough question.
Yeah, I would probably definitely focus it on the conservation. I would one thing that I'm always amazed at is how much. And again, having spent a lot of time with individual animals, individual leopards, elephants, and is seeing how close we are to them, how similar we are, how the feelings they're having. You can almost read into their feelings, and they're just the same as ours. You can read their minds sometimes, and sometimes you don't understand sometimes, but sometimes you do. Sometimes you really perceive a very, very strong feeling, and it relates to so much to the feelings that also we feel every day as humans. And this is such an important connection that I would like people to realize, that when they're looking at an animal, it's not an object. It's just one like us, but with a different shape, with different. There's something, This is what I would really, because there's so much abuse being done to animals, also by people who think they're doing conservation stuff, and this approach forgets a lot about the individual and looks more at the species. And so when you're looking at, for example, some people say, the farming of animals is good because you have so many animals then.
Right.
But what life are these animals living? So this is a connection that I would really like to stress out. So I wouldn't know how to put the words down, but this is the concept that I would try to. Yeah. And that's actually when I've been just looking at images for my next book. I would like this thing to come out strongly in my next book. So that's why it's also something that I have in mind very strongly, because I'm looking through the images and picking up images where you can establish that connection very directly. So that's what I probably would put in the.
I think it's important because you start looking at some of these arguments being made for population numbers and the growth of everything, and it's very, very easy to get too focused on the macro and not really get into the details on the individual level, which is like the health and vitality and the happiness of the animals in general. And I think that's
Absolutely.
something that a lot of those, a lot of conservation efforts need to be taking into account. You mentioned the second book. I'm going to link to obviously your website and your Instagram account, which everybody should check out, but can you talk a little bit about Light and Dust?
Yeah. Light and Dust is my first book. It came out in 2015. It's a kind of again after a long decisional process on how to tackle my first book, because I had so many stories, as we've seen, that I'd followed through the years: the caracals, the elephants, the leopards, and so almost every one of them could have been a book on its own. But then I thought, okay, this might be my first and last book. I might not make another one. So, and as a first book, I would really like to for people to have a glimpse into what I have done in these years, and in all the photographic styles that I've worked with through these years. So I gathered all these stories in the book Light and Dust. And my photographic style, I particularly love images of animals silhouetted in the dust, in dust storms, or as they walk through the plains, or so many times the animals kick up dust, and I feel that's a very, very African thing. When you see a herd of elephants or a herd of zebras in a cloud of dust with the sun setting behind, that to me is the main one of the strongest icons of Africa, and that's how I picked this title for the book. So it's this book basically collects the most of the main stories that I followed through the years. Obviously, it's one book, so it's a tight selection of images from all the ones I've taken, but I feel the ones that are probably more at the moment, they were the ones I was considering my some of my best. There was many that were left out, but so that's Light and Dust. It's both in colors and black and white. So some images are black and white, some are color, and I tried to blend the two. It's not always easy to get color and black and white to go along together, but that's what I tried to do in this book, and I hope it has come out all right.
Yeah, through my interviews with wildlife photographers, you kind of see everybody has a specific style, and there's people who take a more biological approach or a scientific approach to photographing wildlife, and there's people who focus on portraits and landscapes, and it's just a wide variety. And I think when I look at your photographs, and it's always just kind of a holy shit, that's beautiful type of reaction.
Yeah, that's what I tried to.
To the point where like sometimes you're like, okay, like I know if I had the right equipment, I could get that shot, or if I was there at the right time in the right moment, I could get that shot. Sometimes I look at yours and I'm just like absolutely mind blown at how anybody could ever capture that image. So if people want to see that, definitely check out Light and Dust. I mean, your work is phenomenal. I'm a huge fan, and
Thank you.
Unfortunately, like you schedule 2 hours, and you're like, okay, like we'll get through a lot, but I think we'll have to do another 2 hours in a few months, because I have so much more I want to ask. But I mean, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been awesome chatting, and I really look forward to keeping tabs. What are you expecting over the next few years? What should we look out for?
I'm hoping to have another book out soon. I don't know exactly when yet, but I'm hoping to have another one out soon. And do
you know what it's about yet?
That's what I mentioned slightly before. Obviously animals and the places are the same ones that I've been, so East Africa mostly. Okay. But I want to try to make a book where I can emphasize that connection of feelings between animals and people. So try to that's basically the idea.
Awesome.
That's basically the idea. And I suspect it's going to be a whole black and white book. This time around, I want to try to focus on black and white work on the next one. So we'll see. Hopefully it will be out. Maybe I would not, at least not for 1 year yet.
What is the emphasis on black and white? Is it a stylistic thing, or is there something else that you think that?
It's kind of to me, black and white. It kind of gives this timeless feeling, and takes away basically gives this eternal feeling, and it goes right through straight to the emotion, straight to the inner soul of the picture, and hopefully of who looks at it as well. So that's why I think for this kind of theme that I want to develop, I think the black and white is the best, because it kind of peels away everything, takes away everything else, and just leaves the moment and the feeling, and it makes it eternal in a way. So that's what I want to try to do with. That's why I like black and white so much nowadays. I'm really always when I photograph, it's almost always looking at black and white. Whereas Light and Dust, the first book, had a very strong presence of color, of especially warm colors of sunset, and now I want to go more towards the black and white. So that's
awesome. Well, we'll keep an eye on it, and we're really excited to see it.
Hopefully it will come.
I think I've had like 3 conclusions in the last 20 minutes, and then something you say sparks another question. So I'm going to stop now before I keep going. But thank you again so much for taking the time. Again, I'm a huge fan. So looking forward to seeing everything. For everybody listening, please check out Light and Dust, and I'll link everything else, Instagram, website, in the show notes. But thanks so much for listening, and until next time, stay wild. Thank you so much for listening. I honestly cannot express how much I appreciate you taking the time. For all information regarding this episode's guest, social channels, books, how you can support, etc., please check out our show notes. If you enjoyed listening, please subscribe to the podcast. We are everywhere that you can find podcasts. Subscribe to Escape the Zoo on YouTube, follow Escape the Zoo on Instagram, like Escape the Zoo on Facebook, and please share with your friends. It honestly goes so far and means so much to me. And lastly, if you'd like to be emailed with each new podcast and any other major Escape the Zoo updates, visit escapethezoo.tv and sign up for our email list. Thank you.